an investment management company, and I'm a portfolio manager. And we've done an extensive piece of research looking into the implications of the accumulation of greenhouse gases, and how this and how they might be, how we might abate carbon accumulation in the atmosphere, and what the consequences of that might be in our world, and what investment opportunities we might see. But I want to say at the outset, we have not done this research with any particular product solution in mind. This is not a sales pitch. It's not meant to drive anyone's interest towards particular stocks, or it's really to take a long-term view and understand how this might impact the environment where we operate. And so I hope this will be interesting to you. It's a slightly different angle. I'm assuming this will, have I done something? Okay, good. So if I can start here. I'm not going to talk about science. I have one or two points to make that maybe veer into school science. I'm really here to talk about investment implications. And we know that there's going to be a massive effort, or we believe a massive effort, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that is going to incrementally lead to a large degree of investment, particularly in power generation. And so that's really where I'm going to focus my remarks. And the primary beneficiaries in this respect are going to be power generating equipment makers and some utilities. And I'll get into this in more detail. And other segments of the market will also be positively impacted, as you can see here, whether it's hybrid vehicle manufacturers, semiconductor companies, et cetera. And then the flip side of this, there will be some losers, we think. Customers, we're going to pay more for electricity, so those industries that are fairly electricity or energy intensive may feel a margin squeeze. So just at the outset, to précis kind of our overall view and where we start, over time, and this is looking at 400,000 years of data, and we worked with a paleoclimatologist from Harvard University in getting a lot of this data, we see that over time there are natural cycles where both temperature change and CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere occur. But what I think is interesting about this is twofold. As you can see, going back in history, you get those cycles, but they're coincident. As CO2 rises and falls, so too temperature moves in the same direction. So that's indicative of what to expect. The second thing over on the right-hand side, the yellow line shooting up to the sky, is kind of where we are now. And that very swift uptick that we see going from historically kind of high-ish levels to now 380 parts per million in the atmosphere and then rising further is directly coincident with the onset of industrialization in the mid-19th century, when effectively we began to burn more carbon fuels through originally steam engines and then subsequently, through other carbon-generated industries or through transport. Now, the impact of this is like many of the slides we've seen this morning. You can see, over a relatively short period of time, the deterioration of the summer ice sheet in Greenland, the snows of Kilimanjaro, and you've seen other pictures. I mean, I think that it's indisputable that we've all recognized within living memory impacts on climate. So we wanted to focus on CO2, and I guess the first question is that the right place to focus? On the left-hand side, in terms of man-made greenhouse gas, CO2 is the big culprit. It's about 3/4 of the man-made, if you will, or human-generated greenhouse gas that's being pumped into the atmosphere. And the scale of that you can see on the box below. And then to ask ourselves, if that's the case, where's it coming from? What's causing this? And this is really where I'm going to focus my remarks. It's really the kind of the red and the green pieces of the pie here: electricity and cogeneration, and manufacturing and construction, which together comprise approximately, about 2/3 of the overall output into the atmosphere. So from our perspective, it's we all have a role to play here, as we've heard this morning. But the issue that I'm going to discuss is less about, say, us driving our Golf down to Tesco, which is a real issue that we have to confront, but more about at a global level, power generation and industry. And in fact, tying this back to something more familiar, as we say here, 150 stationary sources, i.e. power plants and factories, emit as much CO2 as the global car fleet in aggregate. And of the 1,000 largest stationary sources account for about 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. And when you get into over half of CO2 emissions in the world come from fewer than 8,000 stationary sources. So we kind of know where it's coming from. And the other thing is we know where it's located. And I guess, yeah, you can see this reasonably well. The red dots, if you will, are power plants, and the green dots, if you can see, are other sources. The critical point here is it's principally a problem in the developed world or the developing world, China, US, and to some extent in Europe. So we know where the problems reside. So when we looked at that, we said, okay, what are the abatement options that we have available to us? And I think they're fivefold in terms of trying to capture or contain the growth of CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere. The first two I'm really going to dismiss relatively quickly. One, reduce global energy consumption. I think it's a far stretch to think that if we look into the future that we're literally going to use less energy now than we're going to use in the future. The world is going to continue to grow. Industry is going to continue to grow. People want that. Collectively, the issue is to grow in a way that's sustainable and that doesn't leave a lasting negative impact on the environment or on humankind. The second, increase natural CO2 absorption. It's an idea, whether it's literally plant more trees, algae blooms in bodies of water, what have you, that can be effective, but it probably isn't sufficient enough to offset the problem. So we've really focused on three areas. One is to switch to renewables and nuclear, whether that's wind power, solar, or nuclear. Two is kind of CO2 capture, and three is about efficiency. So just to go into drive down a little bit further on nuclear, we believe in our assumption that over the next 25 years we're going to see a sizable increase in nuclear power generation globally. And as you can see, these are estimates from various sources, the Atomic Energy Agency, from MIT, the US-based university, and our own forecast. But in any event, we see that incrementally growing. And in our view, on our own estimates, we see the incremental spend on nuclear from business as usual growing quite substantially. This is potentially a very big option. And the reason is because I think, leaving aside, I don't want to get into a discussion about the downside, which we all know in terms of whether it's security issues, environmental issues, storage issues, et cetera, is that the output from nuclear power plants in terms of CO2 emissions is negligible. It's effectively zero. It's steam. I mean, effectively, nuclear power plants are like big kettles that produce steam that drive turbines. And so the output, it's not, it's relatively carbon neutral. And this is why we think that there will be a gravitation toward toward nuclear power plants. And this is happening in North America and in Asia, principally. So going forward, if you look at the pie of energy generation from today, looking forward about 25 years, we think that nuclear is going to have a meaningful growth from currently about 2.6 trillion kilowatt hours to 7.3, so virtually over trebling in size and comprising roughly about a quarter of power generation in the future. The second area to address is renewables or sustainable renewable energy sources. Today, this comprises, as you can see, is mainly comprised of hydroelectric. That's the blue component. Going forward, out into 2030, we expect that wind and solar, where there's a tremendous amount of investment now, will take up a meaningful amount of the incremental growth in renewable energy going forward. However, there are practical problems here. And you can just imagine them. The sun doesn't shine at night, the wind doesn't always blow, etc. Hydro, you have to be near, sources for hydroelectricity. Geothermal is great in Iceland. It's not particularly good in California. So you really have physical constraints. And so this is generally, we see a big growth here, but think of it as supplemental or co-generative to core power plant needs. So while this is a great area to grow and it's sustainable and it's economically impactful and effective, it alone doesn't meet or solve the needs for power generation on its own going forward. And as you can see here, the business as usual case peaks relatively early because there are a tremendous amount of regulatory or government incentives being put in place to promote the development of renewable resources now. It's here, it's now, the technology is available, it is happening today, as we all know, and this is beneficial. But what we think is this is going to tail off somewhat over time because the critical issue that we need to address is really in coal-burning power plants. And that really is the thing I want to address in more detail. But here, looking just at renewables, we can see a sizable growth in the output from renewables, but as a share of the overall market, it remains relatively static.